The transport shuttle cut through the dry wind as it descended toward the cracked plateau of Vator, a world known in the Galactic Academy for its merciless climate and deceptive terrain. When the hatch opened, the cadets stepped out into an expanse of dust the color of burnt copper. The air shimmered with quiet heat, and the horizon wavered like a mirage. Ethan Cole felt the dryness settle on his skin immediately, as if the planet were pulling moisture out of him the moment he arrived. He squinted at the landscape, noticing how the ground fractured into long, uneven veins stretching toward distant dunes. The instructor stood tall on a rocky outcrop, his silhouette sharp against the pale sky. His voice cut through the silence with a tone designed to unsettle newcomers. He told them that the task for the day was simple. Find water if you can. No tools, no guidance, no maps. Just raw instinct and the ability to read what the land offered. Most cadets shifted uncomfortably at the announcement. The alien species among them relied heavily on moisture-sensitive membranes or internal sensors calibrated to detect water traces. On other worlds, those senses gave them a natural advantage, but here on Vator, the ground emitted nothing but dryness. The cadets ran their palms over the cracked surface, expecting some kind of signal, but the sensors embedded in their skin remained silent. Ethan watched them with quiet interest. He never had those biological gifts. His species had evolved without natural detectors or membranes, and he had always been aware that the Academy expected humans to struggle on tests like this. Yet he also knew that Earth's history was full of deserts, droughts, and unforgiving landscapes. Generations of humans had survived those conditions using observation, patience, and simple reasoning. Ethan stepped away from the group slowly. He wanted to understand the terrain with his eyes and his hands. He knelt and touched the ground. The dust was warm but not scalding. When he pressed deeper, he realized it held a faint, lingering coolness beneath the sun-baked top layer. That alone told him something important. The planet retained moisture somewhere under the surface, even if it refused to reveal it easily. The instructor walked past him briefly, his steps steady and deliberate. He didn't look directly at Ethan, but his presence radiated a silent challenge, as if he waited for someone to break under the pressure. Ethan didn't react. He had faced pressure before, and he understood that in survival tests, the first one to panic already lost. The other cadets scattered across the plateau in small groups. Each of them hoped that his biological abilities would prevail eventually, even if the sensors were currently failing. Ethan watched one cadet place his hands against a rock formation and hold his breath expectantly, waiting for the faint vibration that usually indicated underground moisture. Nothing happened. The cadet cursed under his breath and moved on. Another cadet tried to dig with his claws, but the dry crust was too thick, causing him to stop after only making a shallow dent. The frustration among them grew fast, and Ethan could already sense the rising tension. He walked toward a line of jagged stones that cast a thin shadow across the surface. As he stepped into the shade, he stopped and crouched again. Under the stones, the dust felt slightly different. It carried a faint smell, not strong enough to be water, but enough to suggest that something had once grown there. He lifted one of the stones and noticed a patch of pale green moss clinging to the underside. It was brittle and nearly dead, but it was proof that moisture had existed there at some point, and life had responded to it. That was the kind of clue he needed. He looked left and right, tracing the alignment of the stones. They weren't arranged naturally. Time and wind must have pushed them into patterns shaped by the terrain beneath. Something had forced that pattern, and he wanted to know what. Ethan stood and followed the subtle dip in the ground. The slope was gentle, barely noticeable unless someone paid close attention. He ran his boot along the surface and felt the faint softness of soil that hadn't fully dried out. That softness was rare on Vator. He narrowed his eyes and continued walking, ignoring the calls from other cadets who insisted he was wasting time. He knew that the desert wasn't truly lifeless. Every shift in the ground meant something. Every faint change in color told a story about what lay below. The instructor observed from a distance. Ethan didn't look back at him, but he could sense the man's curious stare, as if he were wondering why the human moved with such purpose while others wandered aimlessly. The sun climbed higher, casting longer waves of shimmering heat across the plateau. Some cadets returned to the landing zone, already dehydrated and uncertain. Others argued over which direction led to the highest chance of moisture. Ethan listened quietly to the wind instead. The breeze was thin but carried small grains of cooler dust from a direction slightly lower than where he stood. Cool dust meant recent shade or deeper soil. Both were promising signs. He adjusted his path accordingly and felt the ground give a bit more beneath his boots. He tapped it gently with the heel of his foot, listening for the shift in sound. It was subtle, but to a trained ear, it meant the layer beneath was looser than the surface crust. He crouched again, taking a handful of soil. It crumbled easily, but left a faint dampness on his palm, a sensation so slight that most cadets wouldn't have noticed it. Ethan stared at the horizon and measured distances in his head. A place like Vator wouldn't waste water. If moisture existed here, it gathered somewhere predictable, somewhere formed by old geological patterns. He took a slow breath and realized he was standing on the edge of an ancient stream path. It was dried out now, almost erased by time, but its memory lived in the land. He rose to his feet and looked toward the instructor again. The man still watched, arms folded, waiting for someone to prove the challenge possible. Ethan didn't wave or call for attention. Instead, he stepped farther along the path, knowing that the assignment wasn't about speed, but about understanding the world around him better than the others. The weight of the sun grew heavier, but his determination only sharpened. He had found the first real sign of water, even if it was buried deep below. Now came the harder part, confirming it and digging it out. But for Ethan, this wasn't a moment of fear or hesitation. This was the beginning of the solution, and he had no intention of walking away without proving that even on a dead plateau, a human could still read life in the dust. Ethan continued along the shallow depression in the ground with a growing sense of direction, even though the landscape around him seemed determined to conceal every trace of water. The cracked surface shifted in color, becoming a shade lighter, and the dust under his boots rose gently with each step, forming soft clouds that drifted across the air before settling back in slow spirals. The heat had grown harsher, but he ignored the discomfort and focused on the subtle signs that the other cadets dismissed as meaningless. A few hundred meters behind him, two alien cadets argued loudly. One of them insisted his internal sensors were malfunctioning, while the other blamed the planet itself for lying. Ethan didn't turn back. He already understood that many of the alien species trusted their biological detectors more than simple logic. When the sensors failed, panic followed. He had no intention of letting that mindset influence him. He moved deeper along the path until the terrain shifted again. The slope dipped further, forming a natural channel that looked like a scar carved by ancient water long gone. Ethan stopped and knelt once more. He scooped up a handful of soil, letting it crumble through his fingers. The grains fell slowly, sticking slightly to his palm. It was a small detail, but it meant the soil held just enough residual moisture to cling. He wiped his hand on his pants and observed the direction of the wind. The breeze moved from east to west, carrying with it a faint smell that didn't belong to dry wasteland. It wasn't exactly fresh, nor was it strong enough to indicate open water, but it had a muted organic quality. Something had lived near moisture in this region, even if it had been long ago. He straightened his posture and continued forward. As he walked, he noticed small clusters of pale stones scattered along the channel floor. They were smooth, too smooth to have been formed by wind alone. He picked one up and rolled it between his fingers. Its rounded edges suggested long-term contact with moving water. He placed it back down and scanned the edge of the channel again. The land here felt older than the rest of the plateau, as if it had once been shaped by seasonal floods or an underground spring that rose occasionally before drying out again. He followed the stones until he spotted something unusual, a faint streak of darker soil beneath a low ridge. It was almost invisible unless someone stood at exactly the right angle. Ethan approached it and pressed his boot into the ground. The surface shifted slightly, and he felt a muted dampness through the sole. His pulse quickened, not with excitement, but with a sharper focus. The planet was giving hints, but only to someone willing to look past the obvious dryness. He knelt and touched the ground again. The soil held a degree of softness that the surrounding area lacked entirely. It felt as though the deeper layers hadn't dried out fully. That meant water existed below, if only he could reach it. Before he could examine the area further, a loud voice echoed across the plateau. The instructor was calling to a group of cadets who had wandered too far north. His tone carried irritation, perhaps even disappointment, as if he had expected better from them. Ethan glanced up briefly. The instructor's posture remained stiff, his arms folded as he watched the cadets stumble across the desert. It seemed he was more interested in observing how each cadet approached the challenge than in offering real guidance. Ethan turned his attention back to the ridge. He needed a more precise indication of depth. He searched for natural markers and found a thin crack in the rock wall that exposed a layer of darker sediment. He slid his fingers along the crack, feeling the coolness trapped inside. It was faint, but unmistakable. The deeper layers still held moisture. This discovery encouraged him, but he understood that finding water was only half the task. He still had no tools, and digging through the crust would take not only strength, but technique. He stepped back and studied the channel layout. If water had once flowed here, the deepest part would be slightly off-center, where the weight of the current had carved a narrow trench. He stepped into the center of the channel and stomped his heel. The sound that echoed back was hollow, far different from the solid thud of dry, compacted crust. He repeated the motion several times until he could identify the loosest point. Once he found it, he crouched and used both hands to push aside the top layer of dust. The ground gave way more easily here, collapsing inward under his fingers. The soil beneath was coarse and darker, confirming his earlier observation. He scraped away more material, creating a shallow indentation. Each layer he removed revealed soil that grew progressively cooler. He paused only to shake dust from his fingers. He worked methodically, not rushing, not wasting energy, but following a rhythm of pulling, pushing, and clearing. His breathing remained steady, even as sweat formed on his brow. Behind him, the plateau echoed with frustration. One cadet shouted that the task was impossible. Another claimed the instructor had misled them. Ethan didn't react to any of it. He continued to dig slowly, deepening the indentation, widening the area so that the soil around it wouldn't collapse too early. Eventually, he reached a point where the ground resisted more stubbornly. He leaned in and tapped it with his knuckles. The sound had changed again, no longer hollow, but not fully solid either. This layer was compacted, likely the result of sediment that had dried and hardened over time. Breaking through it would take patience. He shifted his weight and pressed down with both hands, forcing the crust to crack. A small fracture appeared, followed by another. He widened the fractures carefully, making sure the surrounding soil didn't cave in prematurely. Once the layer broke, the soil beneath it was darker still. He brushed a handful aside and felt a tiny spark of coolness against his palm. It wasn't moisture yet, but it was an undeniable sign he was close. A sudden shadow fell across him. Ethan looked up and saw one of the alien cadets standing several meters away. The cadet didn't speak. He simply watched Ethan in silence, curiosity replacing the earlier frustration. Ethan acknowledged him with a brief nod and returned to his task. The cadet didn't move, as if waiting to see whether Ethan's efforts would amount to anything. Ethan continued working, widening the opening with slow, steady movements. He used the heel of his boot to loosen a stubborn clump of earth and dragged the pieces aside with his hands. He created a narrow pit about a meter across and perhaps half a meter deep. This was the point where many would have given up, assuming the remaining depth would be too much. But Ethan understood that desert wells often behaved unpredictably. Sometimes water sat in pockets just beneath hardened layers, waiting to rise once air reached it. He exhaled slowly and pressed his palm against the bottom of the pit. It felt colder than any place he had touched before on the plateau. That coldness confirmed his suspicion. Moisture lay just below the surface, trapped in compacted sediment that needed to be broken open. The cadet watching him shifted slightly, unsure whether to stay. Ethan ignored him and continued loosening the earth. As he dug deeper, the hollow sound returned faintly. He paused and listened carefully. It was subtle, but there, a thin echo, as if the soil below held a small empty space. He leaned forward, pressed his weight into the ground, and felt the crust bend under him. With one last push, the layer cracked, releasing a burst of cooler air that brushed against his face. It was the first true sign that he was close to something meaningful. Ethan sat back on his heels, letting the dust settle around him. He didn't smile, but his eyes narrowed with a renewed determination. The land had finally given him confirmation, and now he knew exactly where to focus his energy. He would return to this spot, deepen the pit, and expose the source hidden beneath the ancient crust. The cadet who had been watching him stepped back silently, as if witnessing something he couldn't yet understand. Ethan didn't care whether the others believed in his method. He knew that the signs beneath the dust didn't lie, and he was ready to uncover the truth buried within the desert floor. The day was far from over, and he still had work to do. Ethan remained at the edge of the small pit he had created, letting the cool air flowing from the cracked layer settle against his skin. The subtle shift in temperature was not dramatic, but it was unmistakably different from the harsh dryness that dominated the rest of the plateau. He inhaled slowly, gauging how deep the next barrier might be. The cadet who had silently watched him before was gone now, likely returning to the others to share whatever speculation he had formed. Ethan didn't care. All that mattered was the pocket of cooler earth beneath him. He shifted his weight, climbed into the shallow pit, and began to widen it with both hands. The soil here crumbled more easily, suggesting that the crust had been protecting a layer that hadn't fully lost its moisture. He scooped out handful after handful, tossing the dirt behind him in smooth motions. As he worked, a faint tremor passed through the ground, so subtle that anyone relying on instinct alone would have missed it. Ethan froze for a moment. He pressed his palm against the pit's side and felt a thin vibration, steady, almost rhythmic. It wasn't the kind of movement caused by animals or shifting sand. It was the deep, pulsing resonance of sediment compressing around trapped moisture. He leaned closer to the vibration and tapped the wall gently with his knuckles. The echo confirmed what he suspected. Beneath this thin layer, there was a pocket of denser soil holding water. The challenge now was reaching it without collapsing the entire pit. He moved deliberately, strengthening the edges the way he remembered from old desert survival manuals he had studied on Earth. He gathered larger stones from the channel floor and placed them along the pit walls. The stones interlocked surprisingly well, forming a crude reinforcement structure that prevented loose dirt from spilling inward as he continued to dig. Once the stones were secure, Ethan began working on the compacted layer itself. He used the heel of his boot, pressing down repeatedly until cracks began to form. The sound that rose from beneath was hollow and promising. He crouched and drove his weight into the cracks, spreading them wider. The crust resisted at first, but Ethan persisted, applying pressure with controlled force until a chunk of hardened soil broke away beneath his hands. A faint puff of cooler, damp air rose through the opening. That was all he needed. He widened the gap with both hands, pulling apart fragments of the compacted layer. His fingers dug into the dark soil beneath, which held together in clumps. He squeezed one gently and felt the softness, almost clay-like. It was rich with moisture, even if not yet liquid. He exhaled slowly through his nose and continued deepening the pit. The hollow echo beneath grew stronger with each piece he removed. His arms ached, and dirt clung to his forearms, but he worked with a steady rhythm, convinced that he was close to breaking into something meaningful. The sun had begun its slow descent, but the heat remained intense. His throat felt tight and dry. He understood that if he didn't reach water soon, he would be forced to return to the landing zone exhausted and empty-handed. But he didn't allow that possibility to distract him. He pressed onward, driven by something deeper than competitiveness. He wanted to prove, not to the instructor or the other cadets, but to himself, that resourcefulness mattered more than biological advantage. He struck the layer again with his boot, and this time the crust split with a sharper crack. A small section caved inward, revealing darker soil beneath. The soil shimmered faintly as though holding a thin sheen of moisture. Ethan leaned closer, pressing his fingertips into the exposed area. The soil felt cold. Not cool. Cold. That meant water had collected beneath, insulated by sediment and untouched by the desert sun. Encouraged, he pushed deeper. His hands vanished into the opening as he grasped at the denser material. Suddenly, a soft trickle echoed from below. He paused, listening. The sound repeated, faint but steady, a delicate drip, the unmistakable signature of seeping water. His pulse quickened. He cleared more debris, widening the hole. The dripping grew stronger, merging into a soft gurgle. He kept working, clearing space until the soil gave way and a small pool of muddy water began to rise slowly from the bottom. He stared at it, feeling a rare swell of satisfaction. It wasn't much, just enough to wet the ground and form a shallow puddle. But it was proof. Water existed here. The plateau wasn't dead after all. The moment his pit produced visible moisture, footsteps sounded behind him. Several alien cadets had returned, drawn by word of Ethan's progress. They stood at a distance, wary and uncertain, as though approaching something miraculous. Ethan didn't turn toward them immediately. Instead, he continued widening the pool, allowing the trickle to build into a more consistent seep. He scooped out handfuls of muddy water and tossed them aside, letting the pit deepen. Once the water reached a sufficient level, he sat back on his heels. It was muddy and undrinkable in its current state, but it was water nonetheless, something none of the others had managed to find. The cadets finally approached. One of them knelt at the pit's edge, staring into the murky pool in disbelief. His expression flickered between frustration and admiration. Ethan ignored their reactions and focused instead on the subtle shifts in the soil. The well needed reinforcement before it could collapse under the weight of incoming water. He collected more stones and placed them around the inner walls, pushing them firmly into the sides. The stones pressed into the compact soil, creating a structural barrier that held the walls in place as the pit filled. The instructor had moved closer as well, though he maintained a professional distance. Ethan could feel his stare, heavy and assessing, as though the man were re-evaluating his assumptions about the human cadet. Ethan didn't break his concentration. He worked until the well held steady and the water level reached his knuckles when he touched the surface. The pool was still murky, but it no longer seeped back into the soil. It remained stable. He stood slowly, wiping dirt from his hands onto his pants. His arms trembled slightly from the effort, but his focus remained sharp. He had found water, but the next step was just as important, making it usable. The other cadets remained silent, overwhelmed by what he had achieved. Ethan didn't acknowledge them. His eyes stayed fixed on the pool. He already had the next stage forming in his mind, and he knew that his work was far from finished. He needed to make the water drinkable, and he knew exactly how to begin. The well was only the beginning of what he intended to build. Ethan remained standing beside the shallow but stable pool, studying the rising water with narrowed eyes. The cadets who had gathered continued staring in silence, unsure whether to approach the well or keep their distance. The instructor stood farther away with his arms still crossed, but the stiffness in his posture had softened. Ethan ignored all of them. He understood that the water in front of him was not yet safe to drink. It held too much sediment, too many suspended particles from the compressed layers he had broken through. A careless cadet might drink it in desperation and fall ill. Ethan had no intention of letting that happen, to himself or to anyone else. The heat pressed down on his shoulders as he stepped away from the well, scanning the terrain for specific materials. He needed charcoal, sand, and porous stone. The desert seemed barren at first glance, but he knew better. A world this old hid its resources in plain sight, disguised by dust and heat. He walked toward a patch of scorched earth near the base of the ridge. The ground there was darker, covered in fragments of brittle, blackened plant matter. He crouched and sifted through the remains. When he crushed a piece between his fingers, it left a faint charcoal stain on his skin. It was fragile, but it would work. He collected as much as he could, filling his pockets and cupping handfuls of it against his chest. When his pockets were full, he returned to the channel and placed the charcoal near the well. Next, he needed sand. That part was simpler. The sides of the channel were lined with fine grains that had collected from countless sandstorms. He dragged his hands along the surface, gathering enough to form a substantial pile beside the charcoal. Last, he needed porous stones to act as the final requirement for filtration. That part required more searching. He moved toward a cluster of jagged rocks rising from the plateau like the ribs of an ancient creature. He examined each stone carefully, tapping them with his knuckles. Most were too dense. He needed something lighter, something with pockets of air trapped within it. After several minutes of searching, he found a stone that yielded a soft, hollow sound when struck. He lifted it and felt its unusual lightness. The surface was pitted with small holes, tiny channels carved by natural weathering. This was exactly what he needed. He gathered as many of these stones as he could carry and returned to the well. The cadets watched as he arranged the materials, their earlier confusion shifting into tentative admiration. They whispered among themselves, but none approached closer than a few steps. Ethan knelt beside the well and began shaping a shallow basin next to the reinforced wall. He pressed the charcoal into the bottom layer, crushing it into smaller fragments with the heels of his hands. The dust from the charcoal clung to his arms, marking faint streaks along his skin. Once the charcoal formed a firm base, he added a thick layer of sand on top. He pressed it down, smoothing it into place. The porous stones came last. He arranged them in a loose pattern, allowing gaps between them so the water could move through slowly. The resulting structure resembled a small mound, simple in appearance but carefully balanced. It was a miniature filtration system, primitive but effective when built with the right materials in the right order. Ethan stepped back to examine the structure. He checked the stability of each layer, making small adjustments. He wanted the incoming water to flow through the materials gradually, forcing sediment to remain on one side while clean water emerged on the other. Once he was satisfied with the setup, he dug a narrow channel connecting the well to the filtration mound. The channel sloped gently downward, ensuring that water would flow through without pooling. When everything was ready, he cupped his hands and scooped water from the well, pouring it into the top of the filtration mound. The water seeped through the stones, then passed through the sand, and finally dripped through the charcoal layer before emerging on the opposite side. At first it came out slowly, in uneven drops. Ethan waited, his expression unreadable. Then the drops grew clearer, forming a thin, steady line of water that collected in a small depression he had carved in the ground. It was still tinted by the sand, but it was drastically clearer than the murky liquid in the well. One of the alien cadets took a hesitant step forward, staring at the filtered water as if unable to believe what he saw. His posture stiffened, his eyes wide, but he didn't speak. The instructor, however, approached with measured steps. He stopped a meter behind Ethan, silent but observant. His presence hung heavy in the air. Ethan didn't look back. Instead, he scooped a handful of the filtered water and studied it. It was not perfectly transparent, but it no longer carried thick sediment. He brought it close to his face, examining the clarity in the sunlight, then drank just enough to test its safety. The water tasted earthy, but not foul. His throat felt soothed rather than irritated, confirming that the charcoal had absorbed the worst impurities. He lowered his hand and exhaled slowly. The cadet behind him flinched at the sight, as if expecting Ethan to collapse from drinking something dangerous. When nothing happened, the cadet's stance softened. Ethan stood and stepped aside, allowing others to approach. He didn't announce that the water was safe. He simply left space for the cadets to decide for themselves. One cadet knelt cautiously and dipped his hands into the filtered pool. He lifted the water to his lips, drank a small amount, and blinked in surprise. His shoulders relaxed. For the first time since the challenge began, someone other than Ethan experienced relief. The instructor finally spoke. His voice was firm, but no longer sharp. He told the cadets to observe what Ethan had done. He pointed out the well, the reinforcement stones, and the filtration mound. He didn't praise Ethan directly, but the meaning was clear. He wanted every cadet to understand the difference between following instinct and applying thought. Ethan listened in silence, but he didn't break his focus. He continued adjusting the filtration mound, refining the placement of the stones and smoothing the sand so the water would flow more evenly. He understood that the system would weaken over time if not maintained. The water seeping from the well grew clearer as the minutes passed, filling the basin beside the filter. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the plateau. The air grew cooler, and the colors of the land softened from harsh copper to muted gold. The alien cadets gathered around the well now, their earlier frustration replaced with awe. Some of them studied the filtration system closely, trying to understand how each layer contributed to the process. Others simply drank, grateful for relief. Ethan stepped back, giving them space. His hands were coated in dirt and charcoal, his skin scratched from digging, but he remained calm and collected. The instructor watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away, calling the cadets back into formation. The challenge was nearly complete, but Ethan sensed that the instructor had already made his decision. The man had expected the plateau to break the cadets. Instead, Ethan had turned the test into an opportunity to show what careful observation and deliberate action could accomplish. The filtered water shimmered under the fading light. The cadets drank quietly. Ethan stood at the edge of the scene, knowing that the final judgment was coming soon. The instructor's voice carried across the plateau with a firmness that silenced the murmurs among the cadets. The order to assemble rang with an undertone of finality, as if he had reached a conclusion long before speaking it aloud. Ethan remained at the edge of the filtered pool for a moment, watching the last strands of sunlight dissolve into copper twilight. The desert shifted with the temperature drop, releasing a faint, cool breeze that brushed against his face. He wiped the remaining charcoal from his hands and stepped away from the filtration mound, ready to rejoin the formation. As he approached, the cadets parted slightly, forming a narrow path for him. Their earlier skepticism had evaporated, replaced by lingering awe and the silent acknowledgement of what he had accomplished. One cadet, who had been the first to taste the filtered water, nodded stiffly at Ethan. The gesture was small but sincere, and Ethan returned it with a brief incline of his head before taking his place in the line. The instructor paced before the assembled cadets with slow, measured steps. He stopped occasionally to examine one of them, his gaze sharp but no longer harsh. His boots left clean imprints in the dust, forming deliberate patterns that mirrored the precision he demanded from every trial. Yet his attention repeatedly drifted to the well and the filtration mound behind Ethan, as if the sight challenged something he had believed before. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. It lacked the sharp, testing edge he usually carried. Instead, it held a restrained respect, the kind that came only from witnessing something undeniable. He addressed the group as a whole, not singling out anyone yet. He told them that the plateau had been chosen for its difficulty. The planet was known for swallowing biological sensors, for confusing instincts, and for crushing the overconfident. He reminded them that the assignment had not been to survive in luxury, nor to display strength, but to demonstrate awareness, patience, and the ability to think beyond the limitations of instinct. The cadets shifted uncomfortably at his words. Some lowered their gazes, knowing they had panicked or wasted time following dead ends. Ethan remained still, his expression neutral as he listened. The instructor turned toward him then, his stance firm but no longer defensive. He spoke directly to him, acknowledging that Ethan had succeeded in a challenge designed to break certainty. He didn't praise him with grand words or dramatic declarations. Instead, he stated the truth plainly. Ethan had found water because he had watched the land, not fought it. He had listened to the desert, not demanded answers from it. He had made the environment an ally rather than an enemy. The instructor walked toward the well and crouched beside it, examining the clear trickle emerging from the filtration mound. He dipped his fingers into the pool, letting the water slip across his skin. His expression remained unreadable, but his silence carried more meaning than any speech. He stood again and faced the cadets, telling them that nothing they possessed, not claws, not sensors, not membranes, replaced observation and reasoning. He pointed at the filtration mound, reminding them that even murky water could be made safe if approached with care and knowledge. Ethan watched the cadets absorb the lesson. Some looked embarrassed, others deep in thought. A few cast furtive glances toward him, their earlier irritation replaced by genuine respect. The instructor ordered them to reflect quietly for a moment, allowing the weight of the day to settle fully. The desert shifted around them as twilight faded into night. The sky transformed into a tapestry of deep blues and sharp silver, illuminated by two pale moons rising from opposite horizons. The plateau, which had seemed dead and hostile hours before, now radiated a quiet, solemn beauty. The instructor broke the silence and dismissed the formation temporarily. He ordered them to gather supplies for the evening camp, reminding them to conserve their energy. As the cadets dispersed, Ethan walked back to the filtration mound. He knelt beside it and adjusted a few stones that had shifted when the sand settled. The filtered water continued to drip steadily into the shallow basin. He cupped another handful and drank, feeling the coolness spread gently through his throat. The sound of approaching footsteps made him glance to his side. One of the cadets, the same one who had silently watched him dig earlier, stood awkwardly nearby. He shifted his stance, perhaps unsure how to speak, then finally offered a few quiet words of thanks. Ethan nodded and told him the water would last through the night if maintained correctly. He showed him how to reinforce the sand layer and how to clear debris that might clog the charcoal. The cadet listened attentively, repeating each step to ensure he understood. When he left, more cadets approached, not to question Ethan, but to learn. He explained the principles of the filter calmly, answering every inquiry without hesitation. His tone never rose, never wavered. He taught because the knowledge mattered, not because he wanted recognition. The instructor watched from a distance, arms still crossed, but his eyes softer now. Ethan could sense his approval, even though the man didn't speak. When the camp was set up, the instructor finally approached him. He stopped beside the well, gazing at the filtration mound with a complexity Ethan couldn't immediately read. He asked Ethan a single question: why he had chosen to build the filter rather than simply drink from the well. Ethan answered quietly. He told him that water in a desert carried risks, and clarity mattered more than desperation. He added that survival wasn't simply about staying alive for a moment. It was about making the next moments possible. The instructor listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, the man gave a faint nod before turning back toward the camp, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. Night deepened. The cadets gathered around portable lights, their earlier tension replaced by quiet conversation. Several of them held small containers filled with filtered water, drinking sparingly but gratefully. The instructor moved among them, checking on each cadet and offering occasional remarks. Ethan sat near the edge of the camp, the sounds of shifting sand and distant wind soothing his thoughts. He looked at the filtration mound and the well beside it, knowing that by morning the water level would rise again. the desert would continue offering its quiet gifts to anyone willing to understand it. As the moons climbed higher, Ethan lay back on the cool ground, feeling the weight of the day slowly fade. The instructor eventually called out the final assessment, announcing that Ethan had completed the challenge not only correctly, but brilliantly. The cadets accepted the judgment without protest. Some even clapped in subdued admiration. Ethan didn't react outwardly, but a quiet pride settled within him, not for outperforming others, but for proving that thoughtful action mattered even in the harshest environment. The challenge ended with the camp illuminated under the pale glow of the twin moons. The well stood as a testament to what he had built, what he had understood, and what he had earned. As Ethan closed his eyes, he knew the lesson went deeper than water or filters. It was a reminder that survival came to those who listened, to the land, to themselves, and to the quiet truths hidden beneath the surface of every world.